Rain tapped against the tall windows of the Whitmore house in the quiet hills outside the city, and inside, the dining room glowed with a cold, polished light that never seemed to warm anyone. Amara Ellington sat at one end of the long table, her hands folded, her plate untouched, while Preston Whitmore stood at the other end with a glass of wine he did not need. He was 47 years old, sharp-suited even at home, a corporate lawyer who measured people the way he measured contracts, by what they could produce. Amara was 45, quiet in a way that some mistook for weakness, dressed in the same plain gray sweater she always wore, the kind of woman who disappeared into a room instead of commanding it. 15 years of marriage had worn a groove between them, one where Preston spoke and Amara listened, where his voice filled the house and hers had grown smaller and smaller until it was almost gone. Tonight, though, something in his tone had an edge to it, a meanness dressed up as honesty. He set his glass down harder than necessary and looked at her the way a man looks at an old invoice he has decided not to pay. "You have never built a single thing in your life," he said, and the words landed in the room like a dropped plate, sharp and final. Amara did not flinch. She had heard variations of this sentence for years, dressed in different clothes, softened sometimes into a joke at a dinner party, sharpened other times into something meant to wound. She simply looked down at her hands and said nothing, because she had learned that silence cost her less than defending herself to a man who had already made up his mind. Preston took her stillness as proof, the way he always did, evidence that she had nothing to say because there was nothing there. He refilled his glass and began, as he often did, to speak of his own success, the partnership he had made, the clients who called him at midnight, the money that flowed into accounts with his name alone on them. It had not always been this way, though the years had a habit of erasing their own beginnings. When they first met, Preston had been drawn to her stillness, had called it grace, had told friends at their wedding that Amara possessed a calm he had never found in another person, as though her quiet were a gift rather than a warning of what he would later demand of her. Somewhere along the way, that admiration had curdled into entitlement, the same way a man who once found a garden peaceful eventually stops noticing it exists at all, walking past it every day without a glance, assuming its beauty will simply remain there regardless of his attention. Amara had watched the shift happen slowly, year by year, the compliments thinning, the silences lengthening, until what remained between them was less a marriage and more an arrangement, one where she supplied steadiness, and he supplied nothing but his own reflection. He talked about the house, the cars, the vacations, listing them like a man reciting his own resume to a stranger, forgetting, or perhaps choosing to forget, that his wife sat 2 feet away from him. Amara watched the rain slide down the window and thought of how strange it was to be invisible inside your own home, to be a shadow at a table you had once believed would hold love instead of accounting. She had built an entire life around staying small, around letting Preston believe that his version of their marriage was the only true one, and for 15 years it had cost her almost nothing to let him believe it. Tonight, though, she felt something shift, some old door creaking open in a part of her she had shut a long time ago. Preston set his napkin on the table, with the finality of a man closing a case file, and looked at her with something close to pity. "I think it's time we talk about ending this," he said, and the words hung there, unhurried, almost bored, as if he were discussing which restaurant to cancel a reservation at. Amara lifted her eyes to his face for the first time all evening, searching for some flicker of doubt, some small hesitation that might suggest he did not entirely mean it. She found none. What she found instead was a man entirely certain of his own value and entirely certain of her lack of it. A man who believed the walls of that house existed because of him and him alone. She did not cry. She did not argue. She only nodded once, slowly, and the sound of the rain against the glass seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what a woman like Amara Ellington would do with the truth she had kept buried for 25 years. The following week, Preston arrived home with a leather folder and a lawyer trailing behind him, a tall, gray-haired man named Nathan Holloway, whose expensive shoes made no sound on the marble floor. Preston laid the papers out across the kitchen island, like a general laying out a battle plan, and his voice took on the crisp efficiency he usually reserved for boardrooms. He explained, almost cheerfully, that Amara would receive a modest settlement, enough to rent a small apartment somewhere quiet, and that she would need to sign an agreement waiving any claim to the assets accumulated during their marriage. Nathan Holloway cleared his throat and slid a pen across the counter, the gesture practiced, bloodless. The kind of motion made 1,000 times before, in 1,000 other houses where marriages had gone cold. He had drafted dozens of settlements exactly like this one over the course of his career, and he had learned long ago not to look too closely at the faces across the table, because the faces rarely mattered to the outcome, only the signatures did. Amara looked down at the papers without touching them and asked, quietly, "What would happen to the house?" Preston laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it at all. "The house is mine," he said. "Everything is mine. You never earned a cent of it." He leaned against the island, arms crossed, savoring the moment the way a man savors a meal he has been anticipating for years, and told her, almost kindly, that she should be grateful for what she was being offered at all. He reminded her that she had no job, no degree that mattered, no name that meant anything beyond his own, and that without him she would disappear entirely, a woman with nothing behind her name. He said it the way a man recites a fact he has repeated so many times it no longer occurs to him to check whether it remains true, and Nathan Holloway, standing quietly beside the counter, glanced briefly at Amara's face, some small professional instinct flickering that he could not quite name, though he said nothing and let the moment pass. Amara listened to every word, her face calm, her hands steady on the edge of the counter, and when he finished speaking, she asked him one question, soft and unhurried. "Are you sure about that, Preston?" He laughed again, louder this time, glancing at Nathan Holloway as if inviting him to share the joke, and told her that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. He signed his own copy of the papers with a flourish, capped his pen, and told her she had 1 week to vacate the house, 1 week to pack whatever she believed still belonged to her, though he doubted there was much. Amara said nothing more that evening. She waited until the house was dark and quiet, until Preston's breathing had settled into the heavy rhythm of a man who slept without guilt, and then she walked down to the small storage room behind the garage, where old boxes from a life before this one still sat gathering dust. In the back of a metal safe, behind tax documents and expired passports, her fingers found an envelope she had not opened in over 2 decades, its paper yellowed, its seal untouched, and she held it in her hands for a long moment before slipping it into her bag, because tomorrow, she had decided, she would finally go to the bank. The private banking wing of Meridian Trust occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower downtown, a place of hushed carpets and soft lighting, where wealth did not announce itself loudly, but simply existed, assumed and unspoken. Amara walked in, wearing the same gray coat she always wore, her hair pulled back simply, carrying nothing but a worn leather bag, and the young associate at the front desk barely glanced up from her screen. "General banking is on the ground floor, ma'am," the associate said, already gesturing toward the elevator, her tone polite but dismissive, the tone reserved for people who did not belong in a room like this. Amara did not argue. She simply reached into her bag and placed the old envelope on the counter, along with a folded card bearing a name that had not been spoken aloud in this building for 25 years. The associate picked up the card, frowned slightly, and turned to consult a directory on her screen, her fingers slowing as something in the system flagged the request. She excused herself and disappeared through a set of frosted glass doors, and for a moment, Amara stood alone in the vast, quiet lobby, rain still visible through the windows behind her, the city gray and indifferent beyond the glass. She thought, standing there, of how many times over the years she had walked into rooms exactly like this one and been quietly steered toward the exit, mistaken for someone who did not belong, simply because her coat was plain and her voice was soft, and she thought, too, of how easily people confused humility with insignificance, as though a person's value could be read entirely off the surface of their sleeves. Then the doors opened again, and a man in his 50s stepped through them so quickly that his tie had not finished settling against his chest, his eyes already fixed on Amara with an expression somewhere between disbelief and reverence. Darius Monroe had run this branch for over 15 years, had served Helix Dynamics and its founders for more than 25, and he had believed, like almost everyone else in this city, that the woman standing before him now had died in an accident a quarter-century ago. He crossed the lobby in long strides, ignoring the associate who trailed behind him in confusion, and stopped an arm's length from Amara, studying her face as though checking it against a memory he had never expected to need again. "Mrs. Ellington," he said, and then, correcting himself, voice dropping into something both formal and unmistakably moved. "Miss Ellington, welcome back." The words landed across the lobby like a bell struck in an empty church, and every head within earshot turned, tellers pausing mid-transaction, a security guard straightening near the door, the young associate's mouth falling slightly open as she realized she had just tried to send someone to the ground floor who apparently required an escort of an entirely different kind. Amara said nothing for a moment, only allowed herself the smallest, tiredest smile. The smile of a woman who had spent 25 years being invisible and had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Darius extended his arm toward the elevator, his voice quiet now, meant only for her. "Please," he said, "let's not do this out here." And as the elevator doors closed around them, sealing off the stunned lobby and its rippling silence, neither of them spoke another word, because both of them understood that whatever came next would change more than just a bank record. The private room on the top floor was quiet, wood-paneled, the kind of space built for conversations too important for open air, and Darius Monroe closed the door behind them before he allowed himself to exhale. He sat across from Amara at a small round table, his hands trembling slightly as he opened a drawer and retrieved a thin, sealed folder that had clearly not been touched in years, its edges soft with age, despite careful storage. 25 years, he said, shaking his head slowly. Everyone believed you sold your shares before the accident. That's the story that's been told so many times it became history. Amara folded her hands on the table and said nothing, letting him speak, because some truths were easier heard than told. Darius explained that in the chaos following her accident, the company's early records had been quietly restructured, that a story had been allowed to circulate, one where the reclusive co-founder had cashed out and vanished, choosing privacy over fame. But that was never true, Darius said, sliding the folder toward her. Your shares were never sold. They were placed into an irrevocable trust the week before your accident, structured so that no one, not even the board, could touch them without your explicit, verified consent. He explained that the paperwork had been buried deliberately, at her own request, all those years ago, a request made by a woman who had wanted, more than anything, to disappear from the story she had helped write. Amara opened the folder slowly, her eyes moving over documents she recognized from another lifetime, a lifetime when she had stayed awake for 3 days, straight wiring together the first working prototype of what would become Helix Dynamics, when her name had meant something entirely different than it did now. She remembered the smell of solder and burnt coffee, the sound of her own laughter echoing off bare concrete walls at 3 a.m, the particular exhaustion of a mind working faster than the hands could keep pace with. And for a moment the boardrooms and courtrooms of her later life fell away entirely, replaced by the raw, uncomplicated joy of building something that had never existed before her. Darius watched her read, his voice softening. You are the last living founder, Miss Ellington, and that trust has been growing, untouched, for 25 years. He turned the final page toward her, and for the first time, Amara saw the number that had been sitting quietly behind her name for a quarter-century, a figure so large it seemed to belong to some other woman's life entirely, some other story she had only read about. Darius watched her face carefully, searching for the reaction he expected. Shock, perhaps disbelief. But what he saw instead was something quieter, something closer to grief. There's more, he said gently. The board believes all 3 original founders are deceased. That belief is currently written into every public filing this company has issued for over a decade. Amara closed the folder slowly, her fingers resting on its cover, and looked up at Darius with an expression that had settled, finally, into something resembling calm. "Then it's time someone told them the truth," she said, and outside the window behind her, the rain had finally begun to ease, as though even the sky understood that something enormous had just been set into motion. Within 48 hours, the verification moved through Meridian Trust's compliance department and landed, quietly at first, on the desk of Helix Dynamics General Counsel. A notice flagged for immediate executive attention. Vivian Cross, the company's current chief executive, read the notice twice before setting it down, certain it had to be some clerical error, or, worse, an elaborate fraud attempt targeting a company now valued in the tens of billions. She was 42 years old, sharp, deliberate, a woman who had built her entire career on the assumption that Helix Dynamics founders were legends of the past. 3 brilliant minds, long deceased, their names etched onto a lobby wall like saints in a chapel no one visited anymore. She called an emergency meeting, gathering Nathan Holloway, the company's outside counsel, and Edwin Mercer, the 70-year-old chairman of the board, who had personally overseen the company since its earliest, most fragile years. "This is either the greatest fraud attempt this company has ever seen," Vivian said, sliding the file across the conference table, "or something none of us are prepared for." Edwin Mercer put on his reading glasses slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he suspects the words in front of him will matter more than he wants them to. He read the trust documentation in silence, his expression unreadable, while Nathan Holloway cross-referenced signatures against archived legal filings from a quarter-century ago, filings that predated most of the people currently sitting in that room. The verification took most of the afternoon. Forensic accountants pulled in, handwriting specialists consulted, biometric records cross-checked against decades-old employment files that had nearly been purged in a system migration years earlier. At one point, a junior analyst discovered an old employee badge photograph buried in an archived server, the image grainy and faded. And when it was placed beside a current photograph of Amara taken from her bank file, the resemblance was undeniable enough that even the most skeptical member of the compliance team fell silent. By early evening, the room had gone entirely silent, the kind of silence that falls over people who have just watched a fact they considered settled quietly dissolve in front of them. Nathan Holloway finally looked up from his laptop, his voice unusually careful. "Every document is authentic," he said. "The trust was properly executed. The identity has been confirmed through 3 independent channels." Edwin Mercer removed his glasses and set them down on the table, his hands, for the first time in years, visibly unsteady. He had known Amara personally in the earliest days, had watched her argue engineering decisions with a ferocity that belied her quiet reputation, and he had grieved her disappearance privately for years, without ever quite understanding why the grief never fully faded the way grief for the dead usually does. "Then it's true," he said quietly, and the words seemed to cost him something, some private grief resurfacing after decades kept carefully out of view. Vivian Cross sat back in her chair, staring at the folder as though it might rearrange itself into something less impossible if she looked at it long enough. She had joined Helix Dynamics a full decade after its founding, had climbed through its ranks entirely on the strength of the systems and structures Amara had quietly built, and it struck her now, with an almost dizzying suddenness, that the woman whose invisible architecture had shaped her own career might have been alive and unseen the entire time she had spent building on top of it. "We built an entire corporate mythology around 3 founders who died building this company," she said slowly. "Employee training, museum exhibits, an entire origin story taught to every new hire." Nathan Holloway nodded grimly. "And one of them has apparently been alive this entire time, living quietly under a name none of our current systems ever flagged." The room fell into a heavy stillness, the kind that settles over people forced to confront how thin the line is between history and story, between what happened and what everyone simply agreed to believe. Somewhere down the hall, an intern walked past the closed conference room, carrying a stack of onboarding materials that included, on its very first page, a printed biography describing all 3 founders in the past tense. And no one in that building yet knew that within days, Every one of those documents would need to be quietly reprinted. Edwin Mercer finally broke the silence, his voice low but certain. "Then we owe her more than an apology," he said. "We owe her the truth about what this company actually is." And somewhere across the city, unaware that a boardroom of powerful strangers had just spent an entire afternoon confirming her existence, Amara Ellington was quietly signing the final page of her divorce settlement, asking for nothing at all. Preston Whitmore heard the rumor before he heard the confirmation. A fragment of gossip passed between two junior associates in the firm's break room, something about Meridian Trust and a private client and Helix Dynamics, all mentioned in the same breath as his soon-to-be former wife's maiden name. He laughed it off at first, the way a man laughs off a joke he assumes is aimed at someone else. Because the idea that Amara, his Amara, the quiet woman who baked bread on Sundays and rarely spoke above a murmur, could be connected to one of the largest technology companies in the country, struck him as almost comically absurd. But the rumor did not fade the way rumors usually did. It grew, spreading through the firm's hallways with the particular speed reserved for stories too strange to be entirely made up, until finally Preston found himself standing outside the glass tower of Meridian Trust, his confidence cracking slightly at its edges for the first time in 15 years. He walked into the lobby with the same entitled stride he used in every courtroom, expecting doors to open simply because he expected them to. It had never once occurred to him, in 15 years of marriage, to ask Amara about the years before he knew her, to wonder what she had done with the decade of her 20s and early 30s, and he realized now, standing beneath the same marble ceiling that had once made him feel small on a first visit years ago, that he had built an entire understanding of his own wife out of assumptions he had never bothered to verify. The young associate at the front desk, the same one who had nearly redirected Amara to the ground floor days earlier, now regarded Preston with a caution that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He demanded to see his wife, using the word wife with a sharpness meant to establish ownership, meant to remind everyone in the room that, whatever strange story was circulating, he remained the one with authority here. The associate excused herself and disappeared through the same frosted glass doors Amara had walked through days before, and when they opened again, it was not Amara who emerged, but Darius Monroe, his expression composed, professional, and entirely unmoved by Preston's rising irritation. "Mr. Whitmore," Darius said evenly, "Miss Ellington is currently a founding-tier client of this institution. I'm afraid I cannot discuss her affairs or her whereabouts without her explicit consent." Preston blinked, the phrase, founding-tier client, landing somewhere he had no framework to process, his mind scrambling to reconcile it with the woman he had dismissed across a dinner table just days before. "That's absurd," Preston said, his voice rising slightly, the courtroom bravado slipping. "She doesn't have money. She's never had money. I've paid for every single thing in that woman's life for 15 years. Darius regarded him for a long moment, something almost like pity crossing his features, though his voice remained perfectly level. "I understand this may come as a surprise," he said simply, "but I am not able to share further details. I'd suggest you wait for Miss Ellington to contact you, if she chooses to." Preston stood frozen in the lobby, the marble floor beneath him suddenly feeling less solid than it had moments before, his certainty about his own life, his own marriage, his own version of events, cracking in a way he had never once imagined it could. He left the building without another word, his hands shaking slightly as he called his own assistant from the sidewalk outside, demanding she pull every public record she could find on Helix Dynamics' founding history, his voice betraying, for the very first time in 15 years of marriage, something that sounded unmistakably like fear. That night, alone in the house he had once called entirely his own, Preston sat at the same dining table where he had told Amara she had never built a single thing in her life, and he stared at the empty chair across from him for a long time, some unfamiliar dread settling into his chest as the silence in the house grew larger than he remembered it ever being. 25 years earlier, in a cramped garage lit by a single humming fluorescent tube, a much younger Amara Ellington had spent 3 sleepless nights soldering circuit boards by hand, while 2 partners argued over funding decisions she had already quietly solved. She had been the engineer nobody photographed, the mind behind the architecture that would eventually become Helix Dynamics' core technology, content to let louder, more charismatic partners stand in front of cameras while she built the thing that actually worked. The accident had come suddenly, a car crash on a rain-slicked highway that nearly took her life and left her in a hospital bed for months, her body healing slowly, while the company she had built moved forward without her, its story reshaped by absence into something simpler, cleaner, more convenient to tell. When she finally recovered, she made a choice that surprised even the few people who knew the truth. She asked to disappear. She had watched, from her hospital window, executives and investors fighting over control of a company built from her own sleepless nights, watched ambition curdle friendships into rivalries, and she had decided, quietly and firmly, that she wanted no part of what the company was becoming. She placed her shares into a trust, structured to remain untouched, unless she personally, verifiably, chose to reclaim them. And she let the story of her death by omission settle into place, unspoken, uncorrected, easier for everyone to accept than the truth. She met Preston Whitmore 2 years later at a friend's wedding, and she never told him what she had built or why she had walked away from it, because for the first time in her adult life, she wanted to be loved for exactly who she was without any of it. She wanted someone to choose her stripped of legacy, stripped of wealth, stripped of the story that made her interesting to strangers, and for 15 years, she believed she had found exactly that in Preston. In the earliest years, she had almost convinced herself the choice had been the right one, that the quiet, ordinary rhythm of grocery lists and Sunday mornings was its own kind of happiness, richer somehow than the frantic ambition of boardrooms and press releases she had left behind. But ordinary rhythms only stay gentle when both people inside them are willing to see each other clearly, and somewhere around the 7th or 8th year, she had begun to notice that Preston's affection seemed to rise and fall in direct proportion to how useful or agreeable she appeared to him that week. A pattern she had chosen, for a long time, not to name. She was wrong about him, and she had known she was wrong for longer than she ever let herself admit out loud. She thought, often, in the quiet hours after Preston fell asleep, about the woman she had been in that garage, fearless, exhausted, certain that what she built mattered, and she wondered when exactly she had let herself become smaller in order to be tolerated at all. There had been moments, small ones, when she almost told him, dinners where the truth sat right behind her teeth, ready to be spoken, but each time Preston's easy contempt for what he assumed was her emptiness had convinced her the truth would only become another weapon in his hands. She had wanted, more than money, more than vindication, simply to be seen as enough exactly as she was, and the tragedy of her marriage was that she had married a man who was constitutionally incapable of seeing anyone as enough, unless they served some visible purpose to him. Now, sitting in the quiet of a hotel room she had rented under her maiden name, she understood something with total clarity for the first time in years. Her value had never depended on Preston recognizing it, and it had never disappeared just because he refused to see it. And that truth, once accepted fully, felt less like triumph and more like a long overdue exhale. The headquarters of Helix Dynamics rose 40 stories above the financial district, its lobby dominated by a wall of dark marble etched with 3 names, founders the company had spent decades quietly memorializing as legends of an earlier era. Amara walked through the revolving doors on a gray Tuesday morning, wearing the same plain coat she had worn into Meridian Trust, and not a single employee crossing that lobby recognized the name etched into stone, just feet above her head, as belonging to the woman walking beneath it. She rode the elevator to the top floor, accompanied only by Darius Monroe, who had insisted on escorting her personally, and when the doors opened onto the executive floor, Nathan Holloway was already waiting, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes betraying something closer to awe. He led her down a long corridor toward the boardroom, and through the glass walls, Amara could see the entire board already seated, waiting, unaware that the woman walking toward them had built the foundation beneath their careers. She caught sight of her own reflection in the glass as she walked, A plain coat, tired eyes, hands folded calmly in front of her, and she thought it strange that this ordinary reflection was about to walk into a room and rewrite an entire company's understanding of its own history, that greatness so often traveled in such unremarkable clothing. Edwin Mercer saw her first, and he rose from his seat with a slowness that suggested his legs had momentarily forgotten how to move, his eyes fixed on her face, as though searching for the young engineer he remembered from a garage a quarter-century earlier. One by one, the rest of the board rose to their feet, chairs scraping softly against polished floors, until Vivian Cross, the only person in the room who had never known Amara at all, found herself standing as well, uncertain exactly what she was standing for, but understanding, instinctively, that this was a moment requiring reverence. Nathan Holloway cleared his throat and read aloud from the trust documentation, his voice steady now, confirming what every person in that room had spent the previous 2 days verifying through independent channels. Amara Ellington, he said, co-founder of Helix Dynamics, holder of the founding trust, and, as of this verification, the sole surviving founder of this company. The words settled over the room like something sacred, and for a long moment, nobody spoke at all. Then Edwin Mercer began to clap, slowly at first, and the sound spread through the room until the entire board was applauding, not for a stock price or a quarterly earnings report, but for a woman who had built something extraordinary and then walked away from it without ever asking for credit. Amara stood at the head of the table, unaccustomed to being seen this clearly, this completely, and she allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the weight of 25 years lift slightly from her shoulders. Vivian Cross approached her afterward, her earlier confusion replaced by something like humility, and asked quietly what Amara wanted to happen next, whether she intended to reclaim control of the company she had built. Amara considered the question for a long moment before answering, her voice calm, certain, entirely her own. "I don't need to run it," she said. "I only need everyone to finally know the truth of who built it." And as the applause faded into a thoughtful silence, everyone in that room understood that something had shifted permanently, not just in the company's history, but in the story it would tell about itself from that day forward. Preston arrived at the hotel 2 days later, having tracked her down through a mutual acquaintance who worked in commercial real estate, his composure entirely gone, his tailored suit slightly disheveled in a way Amara had never once seen in 15 years of marriage. He stood in the doorway of her room, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice cracking in a register she barely recognized, and for the first time since she had known him, Preston Whitmore looked genuinely, entirely afraid. "I read everything," he said. "The filings, the trust, all of it. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." Amara stood in the doorway without inviting him inside, her arms crossed loosely, watching him with an expression that held neither anger nor triumph, only a quiet, exhausted clarity. "I know you didn't know," she said simply. That was rather the point. Preston's face crumpled at that, and he reached for her hand, which she did not pull away but did not offer either, letting it hang between them like an unanswered question. Behind him, through the open door, Amara could see the hallway of the hotel stretching quiet and ordinary, and it struck her, watching him standing there so utterly diminished, how strange it was that the same man who had once seemed so large across their dinner table now looked almost small, as though all his certainty had been borrowed from her silence and had nowhere left to live once that silence was gone. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "About all of it. About you. I was cruel and stupid, and I want to fix this. Please, Amara, let's start over." He talked quickly now, desperately, promising things he had never once promised in 15 years together, promising to see her differently, to listen, to change, the words tumbling out of him with the particular panic of a man watching everything he assumed was permanent slip through his fingers. Amara let him finish, patient in a way that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with simply wanting to hear the whole shape of his desperation before she responded. When he finally fell silent, breathing hard, watching her face for some sign of softening, she asked him a single question, quiet, and even. "If I were still exactly who you believed I was 3 weeks ago," she said, "poor, small, dependent on you for everything, would you be standing here right now?" Preston opened his mouth to answer, and then closed it again, the silence stretching long enough to become its own kind of confession. He searched for words, any words, something that might convince her the answer was yes, but nothing came, because both of them understood, with total and unbearable clarity, that the honest answer was no, and that this no had been true every single day of their marriage without either of them ever needing to say it aloud. Amara nodded slowly, not with cruelty, but with a kind of sad finality, the look of a woman who had just watched her last small hope confirmed as false. "That's your answer," she said gently. "It always was." She closed the door softly, without slamming it, without raising her voice, and stood alone in the quiet of the room, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hallway, understanding that the silence following him was the truest thing either of them had said in 15 years. The divorce was finalized on a bright, cold morning in November, and Amara signed the final papers asking for nothing beyond what was legally hers before the marriage, refusing every additional settlement Preston's lawyers offered in an attempt to soften the departure. She did not want his money, had never wanted his money, and the refusal itself said more than any accusation could have, a quiet declaration that her worth had never been tied to what he possessed in the first place. Nathan Holloway, sitting across from her during the final signing, found himself oddly moved by the simplicity of it, having spent decades watching wealthy clients fight bitterly over furniture and vacation homes, and he mentioned to a colleague afterward that he had never once seen a settlement conclude with so little anger and so much quiet dignity in the room. Preston's own attorney had pushed, repeatedly, for her to accept a larger payout, if only to protect the firm from any future claim of unfairness. But Amara declined every version of the offer with the same calm, unwavering steadiness, wanting nothing from the marriage, but her own name returned to her fully. She returned to Helix Dynamics, not as its chief executive, a role she firmly and repeatedly declined, despite Vivian Cross's genuine insistence, but as founder emeritus and senior strategic advisor, a title that let her shape the company's future without carrying the daily weight of running it. Vivian remained chief executive, and the two women, so different in age and history, found an unexpected rhythm working together, Vivian handling the company's present while Amara quietly reshaped its conscience. In their first private conversation after the boardroom revelation, Vivian had asked Amara, almost hesitantly, whether she resented the years spent building a company she then had to watch run by strangers, and Amara had answered honestly that resentment had never been the feeling, only a quiet ache at how easily her own history had been rewritten in her absence. The two women spoke for hours that afternoon, Vivian describing decisions she had made that she now understood had been built entirely on frameworks Amara herself had designed decades earlier, and by the end of the conversation, something like genuine respect had settled between them, the kind not built on hierarchy, but on mutual recognition of effort, long unseen. Under Amara's guidance, Helix Dynamics launched an engineering scholarship fund for students who, like her, had built things in garages and backrooms without anyone believing they mattered. She established a foundation supporting women who founded companies only to disappear from their own origin stories, women whose names had been quietly erased the way hers nearly had been. She created an investment fund, specifically for entrepreneurs of color, remembering every closed door she had once faced as a young black woman with brilliant ideas and no one willing to take them seriously, determined that others would not have to disappear the way she once had in order to be believed. She personally reviewed early applications to that fund herself in the first years, reading through proposals late into the evening, recognizing in many of them the same quiet, stubborn brilliance she remembered from her own younger self, sitting in rooms where no one had expected her to speak first, let alone be right. The work filled something in her that 15 years of marriage never had, not because it made her important, but because it let her finally build openly, without hiding, without shrinking herself down to fit inside someone else's comfort. She was, for the first time in a very long while, entirely and visibly herself. Young engineers who came through the scholarship program often asked her, in quiet moments after formal presentations, how she had managed to walk away from something so enormous without ever once looking back with regret. And Amara always answered the same way, telling them that she had not walked away from the achievement itself, only from the noise that had grown up around it, and that the two things had never been the same. She told them that a life spent building quietly was no smaller than a life spent building loudly, and that the world's attention, however flattering, was never a reliable measure of what actually mattered. A lesson she had learned the hard way, and one she hoped they would learn more gently than she had. On the 10th anniversary of the company's founding, Helix Dynamics held a celebration in the same lobby where three names had once stood memorialized as legends long gone, except now a fourth name had been added, and it belonged to a woman standing very much alive among the gathered crowd. Edwin Mercer, older now, his voice steadier than it had been that day in the boardroom, stepped forward to speak, and the room quieted to hear him. "There are people," he said slowly, "who build entire empires and then walk away quietly, asking for nothing, wanting only to live an honest life." He paused, looking directly at Amara, his eyes wet in a way he did not try to hide. But history has a way of remembering the truth, even when the world tries very hard to forget it. The room turned toward her then, every eye finding her at once, and Amara stood among them not as a symbol, not as a headline, but simply as herself, finally fully seen. Young engineers from her scholarship program stood scattered among the crowd, several of them weeping openly, understanding perhaps better than anyone else in that lobby exactly what it meant for a woman who built quietly and without credit to finally be given her name back in full view of the world she had helped create. Darius Monroe stood near the back of the room, having been personally invited by Amara herself, and he found himself thinking, watching her accept the moment with such unshowy composure, that he had spent 25 years guarding a secret that had turned out, in the end, to be a kind of quiet miracle, waiting patiently for its moment. She did not smile because she had proven anyone wrong, and she did not smile because of the number sitting quietly in a trust that had once felt like someone else's fortune. She smiled because, after 25 years of silence and 15 years of shrinking, the truth had finally been allowed to speak for itself, plainly, without her needing to raise her voice at all. Somewhere across the city, Preston Whitmore sat alone in an apartment far smaller than the house he once called entirely his own, reading a news article about the woman he had once called a burden, understanding, far too late, exactly what he had lost, and exactly why it could never be undone. And in that marble lobby, beneath a wall now bearing her true name, Amara Ellington stood quietly among people who finally understood what she had always known about herself, that a person's worth is never something granted by another, but something built patiently, silently, and completely on their own terms, waiting only for the moment the truth is finally ready to be told. Outside, the autumn rain had softened into a fine, quiet mist, drifting past the tall windows of the city she had once tried to disappear from entirely. And somewhere within that gentle gray light, a woman who had spent 25 years being underestimated finally allowed herself to simply stand still, unhurried, undiminished, and entirely, completely her own.